Hello, week 3, and we are dealing with possession and abjection this week. The film that you're about to watch, or hopefully you're about to watch, is The Exorcist. This week it is the 1973 horror classic from the director William Friedkin, adapted from the screenplay written by the author of the book, William Blatty. It was an incredibly successful film at a time when horror cinema wasn't exactly taken that seriously. So it's definitely worth your attention. It took nearly $2 million at the box office on its opening week, which doesn't sound a lot, but remember this is 1970s pre-inflation adjusted kind of box office take, and it only opened on like a handful of screens, something like 30 nationwide, and still took $2 million. Warner Brothers decided quite quickly to ramp up and open up more cinemas for exhibition, and the film went on to become the second most popular film in the year that year. So it became very, very popular. It became a bit of a cultural phenomenon. It was talked about extensively in mainstream media, across the press. It became very popular amongst African American cinema goers as well, who had historically been kind of treated almost like a kind of niche audience and catered to through like blaxploitation cinema mainly. And you know, some people have argued that this was the death knell for blaxploitation cinema, as there was evidence here that mainstream Hollywood fare could be appealing to audiences across the kind of racial spectrum. So, an interesting film, I think. It's a film ostensibly about the demonic possession of a 12-year-old girl, Regan, played by Linda Blair, and the subsequent exorcism of that demonic spirit. I'll not say too much about it. If you haven't seen it, you're in for quite an interesting experience. I mean, it's by modern standards, the pacing is relatively slow, but that doesn't mean that the film doesn't necessarily have the power to shock. And sometimes the speed of the drama or the pace of the drama actually kind of adds to the release, the terrifying release which occurs in this film. It's about 2 hours long, 2 hours, just over 2 hours, so it's a little bit longer than the films that we've seen thus far. And there are all sorts of things that you can pay attention to and watch out for. But before we get there, before we get to the things that you should consider, I just thought I would put the film in a little bit of context for you. I mean, this is a film that's been very well received. It regularly tops kind of critical darling polls. You know, it's often in the top 100 greatest films of the 70s list. It's often in the top 10 greatest horrors of all time, depending on, you know, like who's doing the polling, of course. And the kind of judging, but Metacritic have given it a very robust score, 81. They have it as a must-see film. The user score even outranks that of the critics. The Exorcist on IMDb is nicely with a weighted average of 8 out of 10, and that is with more than 360,000 reviews or ratings. Over on Rotten Tomatoes, it is fresh. It's 83% fresh, according to the critics, and 87% by the audience score. I mean, there's a lot of like parallels between Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes here. It's certified fresh. So yeah, even if the kind of form isn't necessarily to your taste or to your expectations, there's definitely stuff in there that other people have viewed favourably. So that's worth kind of looking at just in terms of that angle alone. It's got a 4 out of 5 score on Letterboxd, where I also give it a 4 out of 5. I don't think it's perfect by any means, and I think certainly it has dated in places. But in terms of its kind of thematic issues, you know, there's certainly something that you want to kind of like pay attention to in terms of what it says about religion, what it says about belief, what it says about spirituality, sexuality, and morality more generally. Roger Ebert, the noted film critic, said that rarely do movies affect us so deeply. We'll see how you feel with regards to this one. Stanley Kaufman, writing in the New Republic back in 1974, said, "This is the scariest film I've seen in years. The only scary film I've seen in years. If you want to be shaken, and I found out while the picture was going that that's what I wanted, then The Exorcist will scare the hell out of you." An element of complicitness there. Michael Wilmington in the Chicago Tribune said, "The Exorcist, like most memorable Hollywood movies, gains its power from the way it mixes opposites: new style realism and sexual radicalism, old style horror, and religion." So, this film courted a lot of controversy on release. It was given an R rating, which meant that minors could attend it. Younger audience members could go see it. It was expected to get an X rating, which is usually reserved for pornography, primarily because of some of the footage in there and some of the content that's in this film. It's up to you to decide whether or not you think it should have been curtailed for a younger audience. R rating is still a kind of significant rating anyway. Lots of rumours exist and abound around this film. I mean, there's the legend that the film is cursed. 9 people were supposedly, 9 people related or loosely affiliated is probably the best way to describe it. 9 people loosely affiliated with the film passed during its production. Some of these are really kind of tangential. Max von Sydow, who plays Father Marin in the film, was it his grandfather or was it his father? I can't remember off the top of my head. But one of his family members passed away. But they did pass away with influenza or pneumonia, or some kind of respiratory illness, and they were quite poorly anyway. It's questionable as to whether or not the demonic forces of The Exorcist carried through into real life. I mean, one of the other people who died was a guard who was reported to be associated with the film, but it wasn't a guard who had ever worked on the set of The Exorcist. It was a guard who worked for Warner Brothers Studio. So, people do die, and many people made connections between that and the film. One could argue that perhaps that was good for publicity and spin, given the context of the film. It's been viewed as blasphemous and heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, depending on what you read, although some of this is somewhat circumspect. I mean, this is a film which features, quite a graphic crucifix masturbation scene, and the Roman Catholic Church never openly denounced the film, and in fact, you could argue that they tacitly acknowledge it, for they did sanction a Jesuit priest to consult on the film and even appear on screen in it. Father Dyer, I believe. I can't remember the name of the actor off the top of my head. Father Dyer. Get yourself on IMDb and look him up. It was banned in some countries. It faced a lot of critical backlash in the UK when the Christian group, what was it called? The Children of Light or the Light Brigade? I can't remember what they were called now. But there was a very well organised conservative Christian group petitioned against this film at the national level in the UK, and it was denied a video home release VCR certification, and it only became available for legal domestic home use in the late 1990s. I want to say 1999. I think I remember buying it on DVD in 1999, and that was a massive thing as a kind of like a young person studying film at the time. And I think it even featured some of the edited sequences, the cut sequences, the spider walk sequence. Anyway, I can't remember off the top of my head that. But it was banned in some countries. It was considered in bad taste, and some of that was more to do with the fact that there was a bigger moral panic in the UK with regards to anxiety over vulnerability of people exposed to negative and hostile messages or violent messages or antisocial messages in the context of their own home. It was more of an anxiety about what people were doing in their own homes rather than the power of the media more generally. But that's an argument for another day, maybe it's for a discussion in the webinar. There are lots of things that you can consider. I think this film is, despite being relatively slow by contemporary standards, is quite an interesting one in terms of its structure and the way in which it's paced. And I mean, I haven't put this on as a question for you to consider, but you should really have a little look at the film at a formal level, like textually. Like there's some interesting sequences, particularly once you get past the halfway point, but even prior to that, where the editing of the film works in this kind of black and white symbolism kind of notion. There's scenes which are dark, set juxtaposed against scenes that are bright, and then darkness, then brightness, then darkness and brightness, or shadow and light. And I think this technical symbolism, it manifests itself as a response to the kind of as a response to the story-led symbolism. This is a story about good and evil, about God and Satan, about belief and non-belief, at least thematically it is. And I think that, as a technical exercise, it's worth kind of seeing how effective the technical aspects of the film are in reinforcing some of the thematic aspects. But that's just an old-fashioned kind of film analysis type approach. More generally, there are things that I think you might want to consider that tie to the lecture I gave on abjection. So many of the responses of the film when it came out, when it was released, reported fainting, crying, vomiting in cinemas. Why might this film evoke such embodied responses? Do you think those responses are overstated, over the top, exaggerated, or is there something in this film that causes such a visceral type of response? Second question. Ostensibly, the film is about the demonic possession of a 12-year-old girl. What significance do you think Reagan's age has to the events of the film? What is the function of religion in this film? There are a variety of different figures you could consider. Father Merrin, Father Karras. Is this film anti-religion? What do you think? Would it be fair to say that this film is characterised by depictions of abjection? How does the abject manifest itself? What forms does it take? Abjection disturbs or disrupts corporeal reality by confronting that liminal space between the subject and the object. And those relationships. How does The Exorcist do this? How does it disrupt that notion of the you and the it, the inside and the outside, the subject and the object? I mean, this is based on kind of Kristeva's work, and if you haven't had a chance to inundate yourself with Kristeva, well, we'll be looking at her work in week 4 as well. So it's worth you having a little Google, a little look around for some background work, some background reading on abjection and its relationship to kind of Freudian psychoanalysis more generally, because these types of ideas were very much in vogue in the 1970s and 1980s in terms of film studies and film analysis. If you haven't read around though, Kristeva, she defines the abject, as a kind of Lacanian, almost like the opposite to what Jacques Lacan calls like the object of desire, or the faute da in Lacanian terms. Lacan rereads Freud and the Oedipal kind of psychosexual development model. He rereads that through linguistics and language, and he identifies like symbols and objects as things that the infantile brain wishes to possess and to own. He talks about like spinning tops and the mother's body, and that it's through language we learn to police what we can and can't own or can't possess. And Kristeva takes that somewhat literally and runs with it somewhat, and suggests that the opposite of the object of desire is the opposite of repulsion, the abject, and that we need both, like working in a kind of binary with one another. So for Kristeva, the abject acts as a contrast to the object of desire, and it's a form of primal repression in our infantile pre-linguistic psychosexual development. And she links it to phobia, that we learn to kind of anticipate and become anxious over things that we shouldn't desire. So she saw a form of pleasure. Conversely, she saw a form of pleasure emerging in aesthetic or artistic experiences that present the abject. So she would often suggest in her work that art and religion are almost like the antidotes to abject experiences, and that art and religion, like films that depict religion, could act as a form of purification that could purify our phobic responses to, or our disgusted responses to, abjection. That's a really long-winded way of me saying, does The Exorcist purify the abject? Does it work in a kind of cathartic way to allow us to kind of work through some of our own anxieties around our bodily hang-ups? That was a really long-winded question, Rob. looking forward to looking at that one in webinars. And I'll leave you with a quote from Roger Ebert. I know I've mentioned him in the previous slide, but Roger Ebert famously said, "I'm not sure exactly what reasons people will have for seeing this movie. Surely enjoyment won't be one, because what we get here aren't the delicious chills of a Vincent Price thriller, but raw and painful experience. Are people so numb that they need movies of this intensity to feel anything at all?" End quote. So, on that basis, Why do people enjoy this film? I'll see you in the seminars.